Okay.
Hi, and thanks for joining us for Lesson Planning for Citizen Teachers. In today's session, we're going to take a closer look at the mechanics of a lesson plan and get you and your apprentices closer to WOW. My name is Emily Schneider-Krisch. I'm the National Director of Training and Support here at Citizen Schools. I've been with the organization for 6 years, and I'm excited to welcome you all to join us today. I'm also happy to have two special guests with me, veteran citizen teachers Byron Adams and Emily Stainer. Let's take a moment to hear from each of them about their apprenticeship and how today's topic played a role in their experience as a volunteer citizen teacher. Byron?
Hi, I'm Byron, and the apprenticeship I taught was Project Green, which was about renewable energy. The 21st century skills we focused on developing in that apprenticeship were oral communication and also innovation and learning how to present in a group. And for our WOW, students had to be able to demonstrate their understanding of sustainable energy and also its applications. So they created a device which was sort of like a household tool, and it was powered by an alternative source of energy. But the actual demonstration of mastery in the WOW was the students' ability to talk about in an informal setting their emerging understanding of what sustainable energy is. And we considered both successful and unsuccessful projects to be a complete success as long as students were able to discuss how it related to sustainable energy.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Talk about future leaders. Emily Stainer, how about you?
Yes, hello. I'm Emily, and I've taught several different apprenticeships. One apprenticeship I taught recently was Share Your Story documentary film, also known as our flip camera apprenticeship. Some of the 21st century skills we taught in on my apprenticeship were persuasive communication, using technology to produce a product, problem solving, and teamwork. In my apprenticeship, what students did was select a topic about their community. They interviewed different people from the community about that topic, and then they crafted a film that actually presented that topic to a wider audience. So the WOW for my apprenticeship was actually the film itself. So the mastery that students demonstrated was the ability to use technology to produce a product, to solve a problem from their community, and to persuade people through film. And through all of that, they really had to work together as a team. I think one of my favorite moments from my apprenticeships was one of the times we interviewed someone from our community. We actually got to interview the mayor of the city of Revere, and it was a really special moment because students actually got to ask the mayor some really important questions about their community, and they really demonstrated a lot of their persuasive skills in helping to inform and motivate and persuade, and they got to have a really exciting filmmaker's experience.
Wow, sounds like they really were an apprenticeship focused on educating youth and strengthening communities. That's awesome. Thank you, Emily. So whether you're a new teacher or a returning teacher, we can all use practice planning our lessons. We really thank you for your commitment to teaching this semester and all the hard work that goes along with that. You know from your own life experience that a great plan yields a better outcome. So for today, learning more about each part of a lesson plan and how to use it well will strengthen your plans and your class. Here's what we're going to be working on. By the end of this session, you'll be able to define the main components of a lesson plan, explain how lesson plans support student mastery of learning objectives, and list strategies for avoiding common lesson planning pitfalls. We started out by hearing about some learning moments in other apprenticeships. We're going to look at an overview of lesson planning and the logic behind it. We'll dig into all the pieces of a lesson plan and what each is used for. Look at some important lessons that teachers that have gone before us have learned about how to make a good plan and have a good class. And then we'll finish out by gathering some feedback. That's our plan for today. Provided along with the link to this video was a document called Lesson Planning for Citizen Teachers Graphic Organizer. It would be helpful for you to print out or open this document before we begin. It will help you to capture your notes as we go through the training, and also serve as an example of a useful tool that you could use in your apprenticeship. It likely will also be helpful for you to have your unit guide that you built with your staff partner on hand so that you can refer to it throughout to help guide your planning for this semester. If you need to pause the video now and gather those two things, go ahead and do that. Anytime you use technology in the classroom, it's important to do a tech check, so let's pause for that now. If you find that this video is pausing as you go along, make sure to allow it to fully load before sitting down to view it. That will be when the gray bar goes all the way across. If you want to view it in full screen mode to be able to see some of the details on this PowerPoint better, then click on the side to view it in full screen mode. You can stop this video at any time and come back later to finish it. And if you experience any problems, please contact the Citizen Schools staff member that provided you the link to this video and ask them for help troubleshooting. So what is lesson planning all about? Lesson planning is the process of moving from the big picture of where kids will be at the end of the semester to weekly benchmarks of where they need to be along the way to get there. You can think of your unit guide like the overview to your road trip. We're going to be driving from Boston to California, and along the way we'll stop in Pittsburgh, Chicago, Denver, and Las Vegas. Your lesson plan is the nitty-gritty of how we're going to get from here to there. We're going to merge onto 84 West. We're going to follow it for 283 miles. Each step along the way is found in your lesson plan. Our unit guide has standards that tell us where we want to get overall, and our lesson plan has objectives that tell us our goal for each day of that journey. Take a moment and look at your own unit guide now. Circle your unit standards, the overall goal for what your students will learn this semester. Now circle your bank of lesson objectives that you're going to use to get to that overall goal. These are the stops that you need to accomplish along the way. You likely used a process called backward planning to plan backward from your WOW all the way through your lessons, 10, 9, 8, all the way to your first lesson and how you started the semester. When you imagine kids at the end of the semester, you begin with the end in mind. Byron, can you share some of the key stops along the way that you planned out for your apprenticeship during the unit planning process?
Absolutely. So I think a few of the key stops along the way, first, the most important thing was to introduce all the kids in my class to the concept of sustainable energy. So that was sort of the origin of the unit. And then we kind of progressed along the way. So steps along the way were determining what household device they would actually build for the class as their WOW, and students had ownership over deciding what that device would be. Then they also decided how they would power it, so what form of sustainable energy would they use to power their device. And then another stop along the way was actually building the device. So we split it up into different, there were a few different modules, I guess, as a part of that project. So they built the frame, then they built the actual power source, and then built the connection. So those three were the kind of key points along the way. And then there was also the other aspect of preparing for the presentation of their project. So we rehearsed, and that was another stop, and then the end, which was the WOW.
Awesome. Sounds like your kids were really well prepared by the time they got to that piece where they had to talk about what they had done. Emily, when you use your tools, your unit guide and your lesson plan, how did you use your completed unit guide once you began writing your lesson plans each week?
Well, the first step I took was I always had my unit guide printed out whenever I went to plan an individual lesson. I used my unit guide on the side while I wrote my lesson plans on my computer or on my notebook, and that really helped me make sure I was focusing on the skills that students need to learn in each individual lesson. So I looked at the 10-week plan I'd put together with my staff member, And as I wrote my lessons, I made sure to pull the correct objectives from that so I knew our kids were learning the right things in each lesson to make sure we were on track. I also looked at those individual WOW benchmarks we set up. Complete 3 interviews, compile 3 minutes of footage, practice editing videos, to make sure that I was including those steps in the earlier lessons to allow us to have plenty of time to finish our project.
That sounds great. That's a really good tip to have that unit guide there with you when you're lesson planning. Just like we began our unit planning process with the end in mind, similarly, we start our lesson planning process that same way. In both cases, our #1 question is, what do we need students to learn in this time frame, whether it's over the course of the semester or over the course of a 90-minute weekly class? Each unit has standards, and each lesson has objectives that set our goal for what to get done in that unit or lesson. The verb within that standard or objective tells us the degree to which we need our students to master that skill. Pause for a second and check out your graphic organizer. You should now be able to answer questions 1 through 3 from what we've discussed so far. Wonderful. Let's move into looking at the 4 components of a lesson plan. At first, for many of us, the prospect of lesson planning can seem kind of like an advanced teaching skill. But in fact, lesson plans have 4 simple parts. And once we know the purpose of each, what the strategic piece of the work that component of a lesson plan has to do, it's much easier to figure out what goes into each part. So today we're going to learn about 4 basic components that all serve to help us meet our objectives. The hook, a short activity at the start of a lesson to build investment and activate prior knowledge. In today's session, we use 2 CT testimonials. The introduction to new material, which is just what it sounds like, a time to share key ideas, demonstrate skills, and provide information to students. The activities, opportunities for students to apply learning and practice skills in small groups or individually to really get to mastery. And then the assessment, where we can check and see, what did students learn today? Are they where we need them to be in order to be on track for WOW? You can use that information to help you plan your next lesson the week after. As we go through this training, you're going to learn more about each of these components and start to collect ideas for your own lessons. So before we dive into those 4 components, let's look at the overall logic of how these pieces all fit together. Your lesson plan, the hook, the introduction of new material, the activities that you do, and the assessment follow a common framework that helps us define how new skills are taught and students learn. Your lesson plan helps you to make time and space for each of these stages along the way. As you'll see in a second, each of the components of a lesson plan has a role to play in the modeling, scaffolding, coaching, and fading that you do for students, and the way that they learn through first watching you do, then working with you to complete something, and then moving and doing it on their own, that you do piece. These frameworks are something you likely saw in Apprenticeships 101 and in WOW Planning 101, and help us see the types of learning students should be doing at each stage of their lesson plan. Emily, could you describe a lesson that you implemented that followed this flow of modeled, scaffold, coach, and fade?
Yes. In lesson 3 of my apprenticeship, we had to prepare questions to ask our guest speakers on video. So in the hook, what we did to introduce students to the idea of open-ended and follow-up questions, we played a questions game. Students stood in a circle and practiced asking each other questions without responding. And it was really fun, and it allowed us to introduce the idea of what's a good question and why can questions be useful. In the modeling section where I did the work, I actually introduced the concept of open-ended and followed-up questions. I gave students a sample list of questions that I had prepared for our guest speakers, And I explained the difference between my questions being open-ended and gave examples of what closed questions might look like. In the scaffolding section in Activity 1, students actually had the opportunity to use a worksheet and a partner to fill in questions using a fill-in-the-blank model. So I provided some types of questions, and I got to fill in the blanks with the things that they were interested in. So they were able to add their own interests, but still use a structured question format. At that time, they also got feedback from a partner on which of their questions were best. So they weren't working alone on questioning yet. And then in Activities 2 and 3, we actually had the chance to try out our questions with a real guest. We had a teacher from the school come and visit our classroom, and the students actually got to practice asking the questions. And the teacher provided feedback to the students on which of the questions were most effective. As we faded into the end of the class and we checked for understanding, students actually evaluated the list of questions they had prepared for the following week using what we had learned in the lesson.
That sounds like a really great way to deeply, deeply learn those two types of questions and the difference between them. Really cool. So when you know what each component of the lesson plan is a good tool for, it helps you get into the flow of your lessons and plan a structure and a logic for your lessons that really support student learning. Just in the way that Emily described, how her students were introduced to the idea of questions, got the chance to practice with some support, got the chance to practice on their own, and then got the chance to make sure that they really could do this well. Take a look at your graphic organizer and see if you can complete question 4 that helps you line up the parts of the lesson to the ways that you might teach and students might learn during that time. Perfect. So now we're going to review each component one by one and talk about the purpose of each component, the elements of an effective component, and give a few examples. You can use your second page of your graphic organizer to take note of the key words and ideas that you hear associated with each part of the lesson plan. The parts of a lesson plan are your tools for helping students to master the objectives. Each part of a lesson plan serves important purposes like catching students' attention, giving them a chance to see a model of what it will look like when they accomplish their goal for the day, giving them a chance to practice, and testing to make sure they're ready to go to the next phase of their journey. If you're on a road trip, you need tools too. You need the address of where you're going, maybe a mixtape to keep you moving, a map to show you your overall route, and your GPS to coach you and tell you when you've made a wrong turn and need to recalculate or try again. In the classroom, the parts of the lesson plan are the tools you need to get your students to that end goal. But remember, none of those tools are going to do any good if they're not in service of your objectives. Just like the address of your next destination, your objectives give purpose to each component of your lesson. So let's talk about the first component of your lesson, the hook. Byron, can you share a couple of different hooks you used in your apprenticeship this semester and why you chose them?
Yes. Actually, the hooks in my apprenticeship were the same. We sort of came up with a ritual every week where students would play Pictionary, but the way we played Pictionary was based on what vocabulary we learned the week before. So if we had a word like sustainable energy, then students would think of a way to draw that, and then students in the class would try to guess from the list of vocabulary words that we had the prior week what vocabulary word the student at the board was trying to draw. So I thought it was great for a couple of reasons. First, it reinforced the things that we had learned the week before, so it kind of helped build student engagement and investment that way. It also helped to invest students in the academic content because they wanted to learn words because they knew that they weren't just going to disappear, but they'll be able to use them the next week and then use them throughout the rest of the apprenticeship. And then it also kind of helped because it engaged all the students in a short but sweet activity that was a really nice intro before the new material that we were going to learn for the day.
That's great. And I love that idea of using the same hook every time to build a ritual feeling, or mixing it up and doing something different each week. Both are great tools that teachers can use in a classroom. Some of the things that I heard Byron mention were the role of a hook to build investment and to activate prior knowledge, things that students already know. Going into a lesson with confidence helps a student be more engaged and more on task. I also heard Byron mention that his hook is short and doesn't require a ton of hands-on effort from him as the teacher, because the students can work through it on their own. Some examples were of other hooks might be questions or quick opportunities for students to connect with the content. Maybe puzzles, riddles, challenges, games, short video clips. All of these things are a way to catch students' attention and get them ready to learn. Take a moment on your graphic organizer on page 2 to add any keywords, ideas that you've gained in listening to Byron talk about his hook for your apprenticeship. Wonderful. So the next part of our lesson plan that we can use as a tool to help our students master the objective is the introduction of new material. The introduction of new material is a time to share key ideas, demonstrate skills, and provide information to students, often through some more direct instruction. This piece of the lesson helps you to build knowledge and skills through presentations, through modeling, while checking for understanding. It's often known as the I do or modeling stage of the lesson. Emily, when you were introducing new material, what are some strategies that you used to effectively introduce new material and kind of keep yourself from just lecturing at your students?
It's a really important part of the lesson to get right, because if we can't teach kids new things, they can't do them. So some things that I tried to help keep those portions of the lessons really rich in content, but also really engaging for students, were things like graphic organizers or note-taking. So for example, in my apprenticeship, we made a documentary film. Each student actually had a filmmaker's notebook. And their role during my presentation of new information, for example, when I was teaching how to use a camera, or I was introducing the concept of problem solving with the 3 steps, their job was to actually take notes on my presentation. And at the end of my presentation, students shared back how many pages of notes they had taken. And that really motivated them to capture the information being presented. Some weeks I also followed up in between lessons and wrote notes back to students on their capturing of that information to really reinforce how important it is to listen. Another strategy that worked really well for me was to prepare a poster that went along with my presentation. So for example, if I was introducing the 3 steps of video editing, I would actually have those 3 steps on a poster so I could point to them while I was speaking with students. And then the third strategy that really helped me is at the end of every presentation, I actually gave students a chance to try the skill briefly. So for example, when we were learning how to cut out extra video, I showed them a 1-minute video, and they recommended to me what to cut. It just took 2 minutes, but it really gave them a chance to apply what I had taught right away.
I bet your students felt really important when you gave them that filmmaker's notebook and told them that they were professional filmmakers. It's a really great way to engage students in the content, but also give them a vision for a future career. I love that. Other things that I heard you say was that use of 2 different ways of sharing information by having a poster alongside what you were sharing, and really giving your students an opportunity to see how the skill was going to work before they got to the time where they were going to practice. Emily, how did you choose to put that information in your introduction to new material instead of in your hook or an activity?
The way I chose what information to put in my introduction of new material was I really looked closely at the objectives. What were the skills that students needed in order to participate in the activities for that day? So for example, if the skill was to lift 3 steps of problem solving, I knew that I needed to introduce those 3 steps during the introduction of new material. Another way that I knew it was the right place to introduce material was if students would need that skill in order to complete the activity. So for example, when we had to learn the parts of our video editing software, I knew an introduction of new material was helpful because every student in the room would have that question the second we started editing. So those are 2 ways I really decided what was important for me to teach in a short 10-minute window.
That's great. Looking at your objectives and thinking, what's the basics here? Where do we have to start? It's a really key piece to framing the learning for your students. What I love about what Emily is sharing is that even though she was talking to her students for a short amount of time, about 10 minutes, it wasn't a lecture for lecture's sake. She gave her students a lot of ways to engage in the material. Pause for a moment and go to your graphic organizer and capture some of the ideas you heard from Emily's example or that are coming up for you about your own apprenticeship. So we've hooked our students' attention, we've introduced the material for the day to them. Now it's time to get into the activities where they're going to have a chance to practice and use the skills of the day in a hands-on way. Activities provide students for a chance to apply their learning either in small groups or individually, and they provide multiple opportunities for multiple students to be working at the same time. This is a time when students have a chance to practice on their own, and if we think back to those learning frameworks, this is really the we do, where they're doing something and being coached and scaffolded, or the you do, where they're working on their own and getting a little bit of oversight. Byron, would you mind sharing with us some of the lessons that you've learned in your semester as a volunteer citizen teacher about activities that really work? What makes an activity happen and work for students in terms of their learning?
Well, I think that, for one, activities, they need to be a certain length of time. Like I've kind of made the mistake this year of sometimes making activities a little too long, and you kind of lose student engagement if the activity is over, I would say, about 20 minutes. So what I really learned is that they should be somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes per activity to kind of avoid being too long-winded and losing student engagement, but you also don't want it to be too short and not allow students enough time to actually put their learning into practice. I also kind of figured out through teaching this apprenticeship that activities should be based on the verbs in the lesson objective. So, for example, if the verb was explain, for example, in the objective, then I would try to make sure that my students had a chance to talk about what was going on inside their household device, and also maybe tell each other in an activity why they built it or how they built it. So it gave students a chance to sort of demonstrate that they learned enough to be able to explain how their device works to another person. And that also allowed them to practice their presentation skills in a less, sort of intimidating environment, like while they're in class. So it was also going forward to that big goal of being able to present their project for their wow. I also think that activities should be structured to get as many kids involved as possible. So instead of having 1 or 2 students present to the class on why they think their project worked, I wanted to have students partner up and work with each other, so that way everyone's involved, everyone's talking or listening, and there's not an activity where you have maybe half the class or more that's just kind of passively listening to one speaker. So I think those would be my tips for kind of making activities be more engaging and also effective.
That's great. We learn so much along the way as teachers, and hearing other teachers talk about their experiences can help us to prepare for those experiences in our own classroom. Byron mentioned a couple things that are really critical to activities. One is the length of time matching the content and falling in around that 15 to 20 minute range so that your lesson keeps moving and has some exciting momentum. Another is making sure that every kid gets a chance to practice with the material. So making choices not just to have one child at the board or one child presenting, but build in structures that every child gets a chance to try. Your staff partner is going to be a great resource to you there. it's really also important that piece that Byron mentioned about using the verb in the lesson objective. That's so important that I want to go a little bit deeper there. So when you look at your lesson and you have your objective, we're looking at 2 example lessons from an apprenticeship that Byron taught and an apprenticeship that Emily taught. Your objectives from your lesson plan have different verbs that help you define what goes into your activity. When you look back at your lesson objectives, it can be a real guide, like Byron mentioned, to decide what should my students do in this activity. Byron, would you mind sharing with us for the lesson plan and example objectives that we have here, what activities you designed to meet this objective and why?
Absolutely. So the lesson objective, at least one of them was identify innovation for study and evaluation. So when I was thinking about an activity that would allow students to actually identify an innovation, I thought about which ones would be relevant to the apprenticeship. So the apprenticeship is about sustainable energy, and I wanted to give students a chance to be able to identify something that is an innovation in this field. So I had an activity where students needed to, they would look at examples of solar power that helped everyday people. So one example was a shaded house. Another example was sort of like a solar panel that people use to collect energy and then power their home. So I think that looking at examples, for one, the activity was basically that students would look at the examples in a group, and then each team would get a picture or a scenario, and that would become an artifact for the WOW presentation. So they would be able to use the vocabulary that we learned for the day, and each team had an assigned innovation, so whether it's solar energy or someone building their house so that it's shaded strategically, that was basically the way that they were able to interact with innovation in a way that was engaging, but also helping them move towards that objective, which is being able to identify it. So in the future, if they see examples of technology that's helping people use sustainable energy, they will be able to actually know that that's what they're seeing because they looked at examples in a group and then also heard each other group kind of talk about what their innovation or their assigned innovation was.
It sounds like you really also focused on the inch wide, mile deep idea by having students focus on one innovation instead of identifying every innovation out there. It's a really important part of a lesson plan, is making sure that you're really matched to your students' level of mastery. Emily, how about the examples of these objectives here? What kind of activities did you design to meet these objectives?
Yes, this was a lesson that was later on in my apprenticeship, so we were really actively preparing for WOW, and we were practicing using our visual aid, which for us was our trifold poster, and giving examples of limitations of our innovation. So what we actually did is divide the students into 2 small groups, and I took one group, and my Citizen School staff member took the other group, and we set up fake presentations. So we put our 2 trifold posters on the board, and students took turns playing the presenter. So those students were practicing using the visual aid, and then volunteers from the audience played guests at our presentation. And their job was to give examples of the limitation of the innovation. And then the students who were waiting to take their turn, they were responsible for judging the quality of the visual presentation and the guest limitations. So every student was involved. One student was presenting using the visual aid, the pretend guest was giving examples of limitations, and every student in the small group was rating the quality of those 2 skills.
That's a great example of a way to use small groups and student roles to make sure that every student has a chance to handle their learning. Take a moment now on your own to look back at your unit guide and underline the verbs in your standards and objectives in your objectives bank. In your apprenticeship, what are those verbs that you're going to be really focused on? Take a moment now to look at your unit guide and go to your graphic organizer and capture any last thoughts you have about your activities. We're moving now to the last component of the lesson plan that we're going to talk about today, the assessment. This serves as a chance to check about students' learning on this lesson. While you should be monitoring, diagnosing, and correcting misunderstandings throughout the entire lesson, your assessment is a final check that helps you and the students make a determination of whether they've mastered those objectives, whether they're ready to move to the next stage of your journey. Every lesson that you teach to your students should end with an assessment, a check for student understanding, in order to gauge how much students mastered during the lesson, and as well their progress towards WOW. Many teachers find that it's most effective to plan the assessment first before they plan any of the other parts of their lesson, in the same way that we plan a unit with the end in mind. Planning your assessment first can help to ensure that your students will be able to meet the objectives and that you really have a flow through your lesson from beginning to end. Byron, can you give our listeners some examples of some of the ways that you checked for student understanding at the end of an apprenticeship lesson?
Great. So similar to the hook in my apprenticeship, we used a ritual for the assessment, and that means that we did the same thing every week. So the way we assessed at the end of each class was in a reflection circle, where everyone, all of the students would sit in a circle and share answers to reflection questions that were based on the new material that we'd learned and the objectives for the day. And the class goal was to always share a few answers to each question, so not one student kind of monopolizing it, but each student would get a chance to answer a question. So going back to the lesson objectives that we looked at earlier, which were explain why technical terms and vocabulary are important and identify innovation for study and evaluation. A couple of key questions from that assessment were, what type of sustainable energy did we learn about today? What is active solar energy collection? And how does it apply to the innovation that we looked at today? So it gave students an opportunity to kind of show each other and then show me that they've internalized the new material and that they've mastered it, and we're ready to go to the next stage in our apprenticeship.
Byron, I know that this was your first semester serving as a volunteer citizen teacher, and one of the things that I hear and really appreciate is that by having a ritual both for your hook and for your assessment, it cut down on the amount of different types of planning and teaching that you had to do each week, because you were able to get your students kind of into a groove. I think that's a really good choice for a new citizen teacher to make, to help both them and their students feel really comfortable and prepared in the classroom. Emily, we mentioned that assessments are not only to check for student understanding, but to help prepare to make sure that we can support them in the next lesson. Can you share some ways that you and your staff partner use the information you got from the assessments you did to plan for the next lesson and to support your apprentices?
This was a really big part of my apprenticeship that my staff partner, Jill, helped me with. At the beginning of my apprenticeship, it was really easy for me to evaluate the success of my lessons just based on whether or not it was fun or if I had student behavior under control. My staff partner, Jill, really pushed me to look at my assessments and to consider those the definition of success. So some ways that Jill and I worked on using our assessments was at the end of every lesson, we would meet for just 2 or 3 minutes, and we would go through the objectives and use the assessment question answers to say whether or not we've been successful. And Jill was really good at keeping me honest. And then as we looked at planning our next lesson, when I would submit my first draft, Jill would make recommendations of where I might want to go back and reteach some content. So for example, if the students had been doing a really good job of clipping videos, but they hadn't been putting the right titles on them, she would recommend that I review that in my next introduction of new material. Or she would help us make a list of things we wanted to focus on during the coaching portion of the lesson. When students were actually doing the activities, we would focus on just revisiting a couple of those skills if only a few students hadn't gotten them in the previous lesson.
Wow, it sounds like your partnership with your Citizen School staff member that you were working with was really collaborative and really helped you think about what your students need. That's a really important part of a great apprenticeship, is working together and having kind of two adults with their minds on the kids and what they need to learn. That's great. Thanks for that example. So take a look at your graphic organizer now. Spend just a few minutes capturing the ideas you heard about assessments here, examples, things you could use in your own apprenticeship, and key words to help make your assessments the most effective that they can be. So now we've looked at the 4 components of a lesson plan, the 4 tools that you have to help your students achieve mastery of the objectives of their lesson. Let's quickly just go over the key points for each to make sure you've got all the details you need on your graphic organizer. Byron, would you mind saying just a few key points about great hooks for lessons?
So the point of a hook is to first build investment in what students are about to learn, and then engage them immediately, kind of give them an opportunity to activate their prior knowledge. And a hook should usually be under 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. Emily, what about introduction to new material? What's important to remember there?
Introduction of new material is exactly the right time to introduce the objectives of the lesson. It's a chance for you to teach students the skills by modeling them directly. You can give them the step-by-step processes they're going to need. And a way that you can make sure that it's successful is helping give students a clear role. Capturing notes, answering questions, practicing skills to make sure they've really gotten into those skills well before you jump on into the activities.
Wonderful. Byron, once you jump on into the activities, what's a few good things to keep in mind?
So activities are a great chance for students to be able to apply the learning and that they've kind of accumulated throughout the class, and then also practice skills. It's a time where they can either do something with a group of their peers, or they can do it on their own. And it's usually the we do or you do part of the lesson plan in your apprenticeship.
Love that. When you close out your lesson and you assess student learning, Stainer, what would you recommend?
I would recommend that you really focus on assessing whether students have learned the objectives. And what that means is you're basically asking them questions that use those same verbs and nouns from your objectives directly. So you have a chance to have a reflection circle, have individual students teach back, or to use an exit ticket where students get to write their answers so that you're able to check it and prepare for your next lesson.
That's great. All of these tools together will really help you bring that focus on your objectives and send students on their way to WOW. So we know that we've got these tools at our disposal to help our students really learn these skills. But along the way, we're going to face some common pitfalls. These are experiences that many new teachers have that are important to keep in mind and plan ahead for as you're preparing for your lessons. With good planning, you can go around these pitfalls and miss them altogether. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. For each one, you can capture on your graphic organizer on the 3rd page some of the tips that Emily and Byron are going to share with you about how they navigated these challenges as volunteer citizen teachers. So one of the most common pitfalls that teachers can experience is not sharing the objectives and agenda with students at the start of the lesson. Often it's so easy to get caught up in starting the lesson that you can forget to review the objectives and agenda. But it's critical that students know what they're going to be learning that day and how they're going to learn it before starting their lesson. Students, like adults, learn best when they know what to expect, what's going to be expected of them, and how the class is going to progress. It helps them to feel more comfortable and builds excitement. Byron, how did you work to avoid this pitfall as a citizen teacher this semester?
Well, first I started and ended each class by reviewing the objectives and the agenda. Sometimes I'd assign a student to check off, so I'd write it on the whiteboard, and a student would check it off, like literally as we move through the agenda, so that students are able to keep track of where we are in the class. That was really helpful because, for one, it's really good that students know how much time they have in an activity or where we are, and then it's also great for you as a teacher because you are able to keep track of where you are in the lesson.
Wonderful. Sounds like you made that a ritual part of your lesson, something that you did every week so it was harder to forget. And you also give a student a job in that, which is another great way to build engagement. Make sure to share those objectives in the agenda with your students at the start of the lesson to help frame the lesson and the learning that they're going to do for them. Another common pitfall that as new teachers we can often be challenged by is focusing on the lesson being fun rather than meeting the lesson objective. It's natural and right to want students to really have fun in your apprenticeship, and it's really kind of a common temptation to choose activities that are based on novelty or excitement. It's important in planning to think about how each activity aligns with your lesson objectives, and remember that for our kids, meaningful work and high expectations are often just as motivating to students as that fun factor. Students that feel like they've been given a professional opportunity and are taken really seriously by you, an expert in the field, are going to be engaged in the lesson just as much as if it's full of candy and videos and bells and whistles. Emily, how have you in the past planned to avoid this pitfall when you were planning your lessons?
It's actually one of the hardest things about lesson planning for me, and so I have to focus on it really closely to make sure I don't make this mistake. Some ways that I help to avoid this pitfall were after I would write an activity or plan it with my staff member, I would always go back and read my objectives after I planned the activity just to double check myself and make sure the verbs in those objectives match the actions that students were taking. Another way that I avoided this problem was whenever I planned an activity, I would ask myself, seriously, would a real filmmaker do this task? Would a real filmmaker engage in material in this way? And that really helped me check whether I was having high expectations for students as professional producers of a documentary film. And then the last way I really helped avoid this pitfall was I asked for help. I asked my staff member to check this in my lesson plans each week to make sure that I was meeting the objectives. And none of those things prohibited us from having fun because we had a lot of fun. But it did make sure that I put learning first and built fun in as a part of the lesson.
I love that question, would a real filmmaker do this? The nature of the work that we're doing, it's called an apprenticeship. And if we think about the meaning of that, it's a chance for someone to work with a professional and gain a professional skill. And that's at the heart of our apprenticeship model, and it's something that has been exciting to students for years and years here at Citizen Schools. I love that focus on the real-world application. Sometimes it's easy as new teachers to fall into the pitfall of planning very complex activities. When we think about all the moving pieces that we could have, sometimes we find that we put in tons of steps or tons of directions, tons of worksheets, tons of tools that go into an activity. But sometimes having a really complex activity can lead to student misunderstanding and be harder for us as teachers to plan for and prepare for. Sometimes the simple activity that goes deeper can be the most effective. Byron, when you were planning your apprenticeships, was this something you struggled with, and how did you work to avoid it?
It definitely was, and I think going into a middle school classroom, I had to definitely remember that I'm talking to middle schoolers and I'm not talking to 25-year-olds, so I wanted to make sure that each activity was understood or understandable and clear. I would review each activity and simplify each step to make sure that students were able to actually complete the activities. And I found that one thing that was really helpful for me was, especially because we were building things, was to build a model beforehand. So if it was a very complex activity like build a solar oven out of a pizza box, which is one activity we did, I didn't want to just have a list of instructions for them without, a visual. So I built it beforehand and then gave students a chance to look at it and see what a successful project looked like. And then they had more of a vision along with the directions and then me helping them along the way. And I think that really helped kind of make a very complex activity a lot more simple and able to follow in the class.
That's awesome. And it sounds like you also made the time to practice those activities yourself and work out the kinks before you got into the classroom in front of your students. That's a really promising practice to apply to any planning process. Another thing that can trip us up when we're planning our lessons is finding that our lessons include activities that are all really similar to each other, that do the same thing. It's often easy to plan kind of a second or third similar activity after the first one, like 2 brainstorming activities in a row. And having repetitive activities can at times demotivate students. So keeping your activities varied and meaningful are a great way to maximize student learning and student engagement. Emily, when you worked on your lesson plans, was this a pitfall you faced, and how did you work around it?
This is definitely something I faced, especially after 10 lessons of working on the same WOW. Sometimes it can be very easy to fall back on things that have worked for me in the past. But I know that middle schoolers, in addition to structure, also need excitement to help them be successful. So some of the ways I worked around this was I made sure that I had lots of different types of groups in my lesson. So typically I would have one activity that was in small groups, one activity that was in pairs, and one activity that was individual. And that really helped me make sure I wasn't repeating things time after time. Another thing I did was use my staff number for ideas. So I would say, I really want to review the vocabulary from last lesson, and I'm not quite sure how to do it. And she would have a really great suggestion, like let's make matching cards, and the students can match the definitions with the vocabulary. And that really helped me because she had lots of good ideas. And then again, another question I asked myself is, what would a real filmmaker do? So for example, filmmakers review the steps along their production schedule. So I actually had students review the steps of our production schedule about halfway through the apprenticeship, and I wouldn't have thought of that different activity unless I'd really gone back to my profession and really thought about that hard.
That's great. Thank you. So we're about to talk about our last common pitfall, pacing and timing. And with our own pacing in mind, I'm going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to look back at your graphic organizer and make sure you've captured any notes you need about the 4 pitfalls that we've talked about so far. Terrific. Hopefully you were able to catch some of those gems that Emily and Byron have been sharing with us about their own experiences. The last pitfall we want to share with you today is on pacing and timing. This is one of the hardest things for teachers to figure out. How long, how short should my activities be to really match my students' skills and my students' needs. As you plan your lesson, it's important to keep checking back on the timing and be honest with yourself about how long an activity will take to explain and complete. You can always add in extension activities, but it's important to think about realistically, what will my students be able to accomplish in this time so that you're not rushing through your lesson. Byron, when you prepare for your lessons, how do you work to make sure that your pacing is on target for your lesson?
Practice is really important. I think that there's one thing to plan it out beforehand and write it down, but you really kind of have to do a dry run to see how long an activity will be before you walk into a classroom. Because there were a couple of times where I wrote activities and thought that they should take 15 to 20 minutes, and they ended up taking way longer than that. So I think, one, just being kind of flexible and getting to know your class and how long your students take in certain activities is also a pretty good tip, I think. So once you get more familiar with your students, that will help. And I also think when planning extension activities, it's always good to over-prepare. So if you think that it may run short, a class may run short, have those extension activities, but try to make sure that they're aligned to the objectives And that was one other thing that I learned while teaching it, is that if I have extra time at the end of a class, that's a really great opportunity to give my students more time to practice what they've learned in the class, whether that's working on their project for the while or getting to interact more with the vocabulary or present to each other. So I think those extension activities are a really great chance to keep on with the material in the class.
Wonderful. I can tell as a teacher you really made every minute of your lessons count. What a great thing for students to have in the classroom. So we've covered a ton of content today. We've learned that every component of a lesson is in service to student mastery of lesson objectives. We know that each lesson is a step along the path to overall student mastery of 21st century skills. We've learned to use each component to its purpose. Whether you're modeling, scaffolding, coaching, or fading, your students will learn better and more deeply if you apply each part of that framework to your lesson. And finally, we know that there are some pitfalls out there that all of us can fall into, and your staff partner is a great person to help you think ahead to avoid these. So before we close out, I'd love to give our volunteer citizen teachers, one, a huge thank you for your time sharing your knowledge and experience with our new citizen teachers. And then as well, if you two have any kind of parting words of advice or encouragement for our volunteer citizen teachers watching this video, what would those be? Emily, would you mind sharing your final words?
Sure. I think the two things that I would share is that this gets easier the harder you work at it and the more you do it. My fourth apprenticeship was much better than my first, and so I really encourage you to keep working hard, because being a volunteer citizen teacher is important work. And the second thing I would share is our students at citizen schools are really special, and getting to know them is going to be one of the highlights of your apprenticeship. So plan your lessons so you have a little bit of time to circulate the classroom. Ask students questions and tell them a little bit more about yourself, because that can really make every minute special.
Wonderful. Byron, what would you say to folks about to embark on this journey?
I think it's going to be a very exciting chance for you to really get to talk to students about something that they don't learn about during the regular school day. So that's an exciting chance for the students, one, because they get to do something new and learn a new skill. And it's also really exciting for you as a teacher because you get to be the person who tells them this stuff. So in my experience, that was really the most fun, and getting to do experiments and kind of have fun in a different way and in a kind of a different environment from the rest of their school day. And then I also think that being a citizen teacher is also just a great chance to learn more about our kids. So it's, like Emily said, our kids are really special, and getting to know them is one of the best aspects of teaching an apprenticeship. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for your time today, and thank all of our listeners for the time that you've put into being part of citizen schools, planning your apprenticeship, working on your lessons, and bringing such cool and interesting topics into our kids' lives. We'd love when you complete this video if you could share your feedback from us. It wouldn't be a good session if we didn't have some form of assessment and checking for understanding at the end. We've created a small exit ticket that will ask you a couple questions about the content of this session so we can make sure we did a good job explaining it to you, and some questions about what it's like to learn online to see if there's other opportunities we can offer to citizen teachers like you to learn more about being in the classroom, about working with students, and about sharing great apprenticeships with students across the country. The link is here on the screen and linked below this video in YouTube. If you click on it, take 5 minutes. We'd appreciate your feedback. Thank you again for your dedication to our students and for your hard work. I know that your staff partner and your citizen school staff members in the region that you're serving are super excited to help you make the WOW the best it can be, and your students are going to do an incredible job. Thanks again, and enjoy your apprenticeship.